we're delighted this morning to have a breakfast briefing on the opioid crisis, easy for me to say, and delighted that Peter Rudd-Clarke and Florence Page of Reynolds Chamberlain are here to talk to us about this, incredibly practical subject. So Peter specialises in life sciences and consumer product sectors at RPC. He advises clients on regulations and defends manufacturers against liability claims. Florence Page qualified into the medical life sciences team, and since qualification, Florence has focused on day-to-day management of claims in medical malpractice and product liability, focusing on medical products. So without further ado, Peter, over to you.
Over to Florence.
Thank you. Thanks, Abby, and thank you everyone for coming on a Friday morning. So, to start,
It's not on that laptop, is it?
No, it was plugged in. I need another technical solution.
So here's just the things that we'll go through in our talk this morning. But to start with, to fully understand how the opioid epidemic arose in the US, we thought it might be useful to just have a quick whistle-stop tour of the historical context in which opium and opioids came to be used in medicine. So as far back as ancient Greeks and Roman times, opium was known as a powerful pain reliever. Then by 1803, morphine had been extracted from opium resin. In 1874, heroin was first synthesised from morphine, and I understand it was actually a British chemist who made that discovery as part of research into, quite ironically, non-addictive alternatives for morphine. In 1898, the Bayer Company of Germany introduced heroin for medical use, and it was around this time that pneumonia and tuberculosis were quite common, but Fleming hadn't yet discovered penicillin. So it was thought that Bayer had found this kind of miracle drug and a cough suppressant as effective as codeine, but without its addictive properties. And it was presented as a safe family drug, so suitable for baby colic, colds, flu, and joint pain. In fact, heroin in the US was used in cough drops and even some baby soothing syrups. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, by 1903, heroin abuse in the US had risen dramatically. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act was introduced, and that placed restrictions on the sale and possession of many narcotics, including heroin. And the use of heroin was made illegal by the Anti-Heroin Act of 1924. So moving through to the 1980s, on the 10th of January 1980, a letter to the editor of a New England Journal of Medicine was written, and that was called Addiction Rare in Patients Treated with Narcotics. And it was quite a short letter, just one paragraph, on a review of the incidence of addiction to narcotics in a population of hospital patients. And that concluded that despite the widespread use of narcotic drugs in hospitals, the development of addiction is rare in medical patients with no history of addiction. And that letter was used by some as evidence of the safety of those drugs. But it's worth mentioning that since then the editors have clarified and added a warning, which says that for reasons of public health, readers should be aware that this letter has been heavily and uncritically cited as evidence that addiction is rare with opioid therapy. Then in the 1990s, there was a real movement towards seeing the patient more as a consumer in healthcare, and the American Pain Society launched its Pain as a Fifth Vital Sign campaign to raise awareness of the assessment of pain and the treatment of pain symptoms. So doctors are seeing lots of patients coming in agonising pain. They don't have a lot to treat them with. But then in the mid to late 90s, opioid painkillers start to become available on the market. And it's in 1996 that Purdue Pharma launched its product, OxyContin. And Purdue were kind of at the heart of the litigation in the US. So doctors start prescribing these drugs. They have something that they can prescribe for this pain, and they just take it up and they start prescribing in increasing numbers. Then in May 2007, Purdue Pharma and 3 of its executives plead guilty to misleading the public over the risks of addiction linked to its marketing of OxyContin. And the company and its executives agreed to pay over $600 million in fines. But the problem's still rumbling on. People are still prescribing these drugs. And then in 2017, the US Department of Health and Human Services, the HHS, declared a public health emergency. To give some idea of the scale of the crisis, I've put some figures on the slide taken from the HHS website, but Pete's going to go into a bit more detail on the figures later on. So what's been the reaction in the US to this problem? Well, at a federal governmental level, it's included the publication of guidance. So in 2016, the Centre for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, published guidance on prescribing opioids for chronic pain. And that included recommendations on the approach to prescribing opioids, so including that non-opioid and non-pharmacological options should be explored first, looking at kind of discussions with patients about realistic treatment goals, evaluation of risk within a few weeks after you've prescribed the opioid or you've increased the dosage, and even using urine testing to identify prescribed substances and test for undisclosed use. There's also been restrictions on prescriptions, so a number of states have passed laws to limit opioid prescribing to a certain number of days' supply. In 2016, for example, a law was passed in Massachusetts that included a 7-day supply limit for prescription of opiates to a patient for the first time. There's been a production quota enforced, so in October 2016, the US Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, announced that it had reduced the amount of almost every Schedule II opiate and opioid medication that might be manufactured in the US by 25% or more. And further proposed manufacturing reductions were announced last year in relation to the 6 most frequently misused opioids. In 2018, so last year, President Trump and Congress passed the Substance Use Disorder Prevention that promotes opioid recovery and treatment for Patients and Communities Act, a long title, which aims to decrease use and supply, promote recovery, provide support to caregivers and families, and advance innovation on providing long-term solutions, so things like trying to identify non-addictive painkillers. As well as all that, there's also been litigation, which I'm sure everyone will have heard of in the news, and Pete's going to discuss that in more detail. But just to say that a huge number of lawsuits have been started, not only against manufacturers, but against clinicians and distributors. And in addition to that, in March this year, the New York Attorney General's office also filed action against the Sackler family who own Purdue Pharma, as well as all of those other parties.
Thank you. So here's some figures here at the state. We've carefully chosen these figures for the worst ones, the scale of big numbers. Up to 2016, data shows a 533% increase in heroin overdoses. There are 2 million people in the state suffering from substance disorders linked to opioid products, and 80% of heroin addicts are thought to have got to heroin via taking prescription medication. And just a couple of months ago, data came out suggesting there's more chance of dying due to opioid-related problems than being killed in a car crash. So those figures just give you a sense of the seriousness of the problem in the States that's beginning to be seen elsewhere in the world as well. What have we got? Well, the latest picture in terms of litigation in the States, you've got 600 cities, counties, or Native American tribes bringing claims to do with opioid prescriptions. 35 states themselves are bringing litigation too, and at the moment 6 manufacturers have been targeted. It's still very early days in the litigation. This picture will develop over time. There's only been one major settlement so far, and that was the case brought by the state of Oklahoma. Purdue Pharma settled that litigation just a couple of months ago, and they made very clear the settlement was on the basis of funds being provided, $270 million US, for the purposes of helping treat drug addiction and other public health problems. So that's where we've got to so far in the States. To try and distill the allegations and defences that have been made in the public domain, there's a slide for you here. The primary argument being made by states and public bodies is under the concept of public nuisance. This is, broadly speaking, they say because manufacturers overly aggressively marketed the products, and that led to a massive public health problem, putting a huge burden on the state. In addition, they're arguing that the manufacturers failed to disclose what they knew or should have known, which was the addiction risk of opioid products, and that once the products were on the market, there was a failure to, whilst marketing aggressively on the one hand, monitor what was happening and take steps to be properly vigilant and deal with the problem. We don't yet know exactly what the manufacturer's defence will be, but we've had some public statements. So, for example, Johnson & Johnson have said that a flaw in any opioid-based litigation is that you have to, as a claimant, demonstrate on a case-by-case basis when it comes to individuals that those individuals were harmed by the drug and the manufacturers were responsible. They say that, yes, 35 states are getting into litigation, talking about very large figures, huge costs in the public purse, but there's been no real method of measuring the impact of manufacturers above, say, hospitals, clinicians, distributors, or other people in that distribution chain. They argue, I think it's a good argument, quite rightly, that opioid drugs are highly regulated. They're approved by the FDA, and there is a clinical need. So despite the controversy surrounding opioids, they are still being prescribed, and I think everyone agrees that for some patients who are suffering from pain, certain conditions, it is the right medication for them. It's a question of how it's handled after that. And the manufacturers are saying it's unfair that they alone are targeted because there's a complex web of other parties involved. Here's a diagram. All these parties are involved in the process of getting any kind of pharmaceutical product from research and development through the market to being prescribed to people and involved in the follow-up as well. So starting at the top, yes, manufacturers have been targeted. They researched, developed, produced the drug. But in the States, distributors were charged with getting the drugs from the factory out to the populations, and arguably they could have done something to alleviate the crisis. Retail pharmacies, there are many examples of pharmacies prescribing huge amounts of drugs to relatively small populations. The argument is they should have known what was going on and alerted the authorities about it. Hospitals, physicians, clinics, all prescribing it. Did they follow up properly? Did they follow best standard practice? Laboratories, could they have done more when they were providing research and publishing scientific papers about the addiction risk? And finally, marketing agencies have also been criticized too. These will be specialist marketing companies who were charged with marketing the product to the public, and it's alleged that they did so in an aggressive fashion that was over the top and caused the problem. So, from an insurance point of view, it's got a good diagram, it's a good case study to show that you may be insuring anybody in the supply chain. You may initially be reading about the opioid crisis and assume that because perhaps you're not insuring a manufacturer, then you are relatively safe. But I think this litigation just goes to show that anybody in the supply chain could be targeted. And in the event of litigation, I think anyone who's sued will probably try and bring in other parties to be co-defendants in that sort of litigation.
So looking at what's happening in the UK, there was a BBC News investigation last year that found that 23.8 million opioid-based painkillers were prescribed by GPs in England in 2017, which is 10 million more than in 2007. There's local variation, so the rates in parts of northern England, where I'm from, were 4 times higher than in London. There's also been a real rise in people seeking help for opioid prescription addictions. There's also, not on this slide, but there's been a couple of interesting stories in the news this week, which I thought I'd flag up. So there's one, I think it was a BBC story, on the fact that the extent of the problem might actually be worse than initially thought. Figures from a study by the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University found that when you account for dosage increases, prescriptions of opioid-based medications have increased by 127% between 1998 and 2016. And in the news yesterday, it was reported that the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, had looked at the legal availability of opioids, so including prescriptions, over-the-counter, and drugs used in research. And the UK was above the OECD average, if you measured by daily dose per million population. But more worrying, perhaps, was that it had the fastest growth than any other country, any other country surveyed, except Israel and Slovakia. From a regulatory perspective, on the 24th of January last year, Public Health England launched a review of the evidence around dependence and withdrawal from prescription medications. And that review is going to look at kind of prevalence and prescribing patterns, the nature and likely causes of dependence and discontinuation syndrome amongst those who kind of take opioid-based medications, along with, they're also looking at other illnesses, so kind of things like non-cancer pain, anxiety, depression and insomnia, but it will include looking at opioid medications. And alongside those things, so prevalence and likely causes, they'll also be looking at effective prevention and treatment of dependence and withdrawal from each drug category. That report was expected earlier this year, but like many things has been a bit delayed. But I did hear that and read in the news that the report's expected in summer. Now, alongside that Public Health England review, there's also the UK regulator, the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, launched its own review at the start of this year. An expert working group within the MHRA met in February to start the review, and they're going to look at data on the use of opioid-containing medications in the UK, how effective efforts to minimise the risks of over-the-counter and prescription opioids have been, and they'll do a risk-benefit analysis of using opioid-containing medications, particularly for non-cancer indications. It's expected that the working group will make recommendations for regulatory action to better support the use of opioid medications in appropriate cases. And that might include things like changing the summary of product characteristics, the patient information leaflets, product labelling and packaging. And those following the news will have also seen that last month the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, announced that opioid medicines are to carry prominent addiction warnings. From a litigation perspective, it's fair to say that the UK hasn't yet been hit with some of the levels of litigation seen in the US, but it's a topic that's very much in the news and has the potential to develop. Last year, Gosport War Memorial Hospital was in the news in June after an independent panel published its report and found that between 1987 and 2001, over 450 patients had their lives shortened as a result of inappropriate prescribing and administration of opioids. Now, Dr. Barton, who was a clinical assistant at the hospital, was named in the report as someone being responsible for the practice of prescribing that prevailed in the wards at the time. Dr. Barton faced disciplinary proceedings before the General Medical Council, where she was found guilty of serious professional misconduct relating to her treatment of 12 patients between January 1996 and November 1999. It was found that she failed in her treatment of patients who later died, issuing drugs which were excessive, inappropriate and potentially hazardous. Last month, Kent Police launched a fresh criminal investigation into the deaths at Gosport, with a new medical expert panel being put in place to examine whether there's a causal link between the administration of opioids and patient deaths. The final bullet point, although it's not litigation based in the UK, I put it on this slide because of just out of interest. It's reference to Indivior, which is a UK-based pharmaceutical company, and that's been pulled into the US opioid litigation. They produced Suboxone film, which is an opioid drug used in the treatment of opioid and heroin addiction, so kind of coming from the other side. And they face allegations that they fraudulently marketed Suboxone film as being a safer alternative to other similar drugs.
Okay, so let's take the states example, see what we can learn from what's happening over there. Like with any litigation that we read about, there's insurance people, lawyers and so on. Litigation in the states is very scary, huge numbers, lots of claimants, but there are a couple of features in the system we thankfully don't have to contend with. One is the jury trial system in the States. So what I think has got a lot of manufacturers and insurers pretty worried in the States is that all this litigation will come before a jury. And also the multi-million-dollar awards that you read about that happen in the States, that you may have to deal with in the States. Our system, thankfully, very different. Any litigation will be in front of a judge, not a jury. So the emotional side of medical products litigation won't feature. I'm sure judges would be sympathetic, but that plays the emotions in the jury won't feature, which I think reduces the risk. The second key point is our awards are much lower, so it'll be different litigation. But given it could be litigation involving lots and lots of claimants all taking the same or similar products, it will be costly to deal with and could drag on for a long time too. If there is going to be litigation here, broadly speaking, claimants will have three routes. They could sue in tort, they're claiming manufacturers and negligence. They can have a go at suing in contract. But what they'll probably do is sue under the Consumer Protection Act. And when they do so, there are a number of points here from the States that probably won't feature under the litigation, which could happen here. One is that in the States at the moment, litigation's key feature probably is that you've got lots of public bodies suing private companies. We did some research, we had someone else do some research for us back in the office, who discovered that we haven't really got any examples in our case law of public bodies suing medical or pharmaceutical manufacturers on the scale we have in the States. Public nuisance concept doesn't exist here, so the idea of public bodies suing to reclaim huge amounts of costs from a particular manufacturer would be a bit novel here too. And also, probably most importantly, litigation in the States at the moment centres around the idea of aggressive marketing done by manufacturers direct to the public. That's just not how medical products, pharmaceuticals are marketed in this country. They're marketed to professionals, to hospitals in a different way, following regulations and industry guides and so on. So the charge of aggressive marketing won't feature, it will be different. So, I mentioned the Consumer Protection Act. This is the route we think claimants will take if they're bringing claims here. It's because it's the easiest route for them to take. Suing in negligence, you've got to demonstrate that, say, a manufacturer fails to meet a standard of care. That's difficult to prove, and there are unlikely to be claims in contract. Instead, the 1987 Act sets out a strict liability regime. So what a claimant has to do is prove that the product was defective, prove their injuries are caused by the product, and they've won. And the Act was brought in the 80s. It's our version of the EU Product Liability Directive, because at the time it was recognised that it was very difficult for members of the public claimants to bring product liability claims, so this Act does that. Now, two key parts of the Act. One is that claimants have to demonstrate that the product failed to meet the standard of safety the public is entitled to expect. And the second key part is that in answering that question, the court has to look at all the circumstances surrounding bringing the product to the market. And it's not very easy litigation. We've dealt with a fair amount at RPC. Problems with this kind of litigation is that the Act is deliberately broad. It has to apply to all sorts of consumer products in the same way. So, for example, litigation concerning children's toys will be using the same framework in law as litigation involving medical products. Equally, when the Act was brought in the 80s, it was recognised it was quite a loose framework, but Parliament, lawmakers said, don't worry, there'll be plenty of case law to fill in the gaps. That hasn't really happened. There has been lots of product liability litigation, but most of it hasn't gone to court. I'm sure you'll share the sentiment in this room that it's risky allowing somebody to go to trial. it's not just the cost side of things, but as from a manufacturer, or just from an industry perspective, having a judgment on the books, finding that a particular product or type of product is defective is bad news and encourages claimants, but it also means that the product goes to trial and is found to be defective, then has to be recalled from the market, which can have huge implications. So that's why there has been a lot of case law to guide us on what will happen next. But what we can do is look at the back catalogue of product liability litigation involving medical products to try and get some guidance over what could happen next. This has all happened in the UK. For example, the blood products litigation back in the 80s, but it's now come back to public consciousness because we've got this investigation underway at the moment. That was all to do with contaminated blood, question mark being over the manufacturers. Did they know of the risk? Could they have done more about the risk? Could they have informed the public before they did? Similar to opioids, did manufacturers know about the risk? Could they have done more to inform people about it? MMR vaccine litigation. This was a litigation off the back of the now disproven research by Andrew Wakefield, claiming there was a link between MMR vaccines and autism. Although the paper has now been disproven, that didn't stop litigation from starting. So a classic case of a product being safe, but a scare story appearing in the media, and litigation getting underway, and although it ended with the claimants not being successful, it was expensive for manufacturers and their insurers. Contraceptive pill, Seroxat. These are also pieces of litigation concerned with, was the risk known about, could it have been known about, could the public have been told sooner than they were? Parallels with the opioid crisis. PIP breast implant litigation. In that case, the product wasn't defective in design, but the problem was the manufacturer used substandard materials. The reason I mention it is because the manufacturer clearly was liable but went insolvent, and then other parties in the distribution chain, if you remember that spider diagram, were left standing as the only solvent defendants left. So again, you may as insurers be insuring somebody lower down the food chain in the supply network, but if the primary target goes insolvent, you could find yourselves being suddenly thrust to the front as the key defendant. Metal litigation. Another scare story for you. This was a new implant brought to the market in the early noughties by about a dozen manufacturers. Only one of those manufacturers produced a product that was recalled from the market and shown to be defective. Ultimately though, because one product made the headlines, all the other manufacturers were dragged into the litigation. They won in the end, but getting there took a very long time and was expensive to do so. So the reason for mentioning that is in any kind of medicinal, medical, pharmaceutical litigation like the opioid problem, you may look at the risk you're insuring, you may see your manufacturer is producing something which is not defective, but if in the public eye or the eye of the regulator it looks pretty similar to something which is defective, then the risk for you is that you could be dragged into litigation as well. So I mentioned negligence being difficult as a route for claimants. Here's some reasons why. Difficult to demonstrate the standard of care, difficult to show that the manufacturer wasn't sufficiently vigilant in carrying out its checks, and quite a tough one to argue that they misrepresented what the product was for, given that in this country it was regulated by the MHRA. So, looking at the Consumer Protection Act as the likely route for any litigation, and looking at what we see in the States, here are some of the themes we've picked out from what we know about litigation over there that we think will be dealt with under the Consumer Protection Act by the parties in the court. First is over marketing. Now, marketing, as I said, done very different in the States. That was done on TV, direct to the public. In this country, it was done to professionals, so clinics, hospitals, doctors. But only this week, there's been a BBC documentary, and it's on the BBC website today, about some doctors saying they were guinea pigs in a big marketing experiment 10, 20 years ago, where big pharmaceutical companies, including Purdue Pharma's UK subsidiary, flew doctors to New York and put on a conference for them and probably bribed them effectively to start prescribing the product to their patients. So I think marketing and how it was done will be a battleground if it happens here. Were the warnings good enough? So Florence mentioned that that letter from about 20 years ago that has been leapt upon by the industry as demonstrating that opioids were not addictive. I think Claimants will make a very reasonable argument to say, look, you should have done your own research, you should have published it widely, and when you knew there were addiction problems to do with opioids, which frankly we learned about in the 19th century, you should have warned clinicians better, and you failed to do so. Same goes for those scientific studies. We've seen it in litigation we've handled. When a manufacturer finds a good scientific study that it thinks demonstrates its product is safe and meets the standard of care, they tend to stop looking for research and papers that might show the opposite. But really they should have been looking at all sides of the story and acting if the study shows something different. And then manufacturers will say that this is a regulated product, like they say in the States, highly regulated, it's therefore meeting the safety standard. But I think claimants will say, fine, it's regulated, the regulator may come back later this year and say it's okay to be used in the future, but actually a lot of these products were brought to the market in the 80s and 90s when frankly the regulations were a lot more lax. They've since been tightened up, and I think the argument to say it was regulated in the 80s and 90s and that's what it brought to the market and kept it there will be a difficult one to run, because the claimants will probably argue, well, since then regulations have tightened up, and really you should have been beyond compliance and not just relying upon pretty slack regulations. And finally, there'll be a lot of debate about the quality of data. So we're seeing more and more data coming out, increasingly showing there's a problem with opioid addiction. And claimants will argue with good data demonstrating how the product is failing. Manufacturers will probably argue that the data is flawed and more investigation is needed. There's some quirks to our system, which you should bear in mind as insurers. One quite helpful one is the relatively short limitation periods we've got the advantage of as insurers and manufacturers. So claimants have to bring a claim for personal injury within 3 years of either the injury or knowing they have the grounds for a claim. So as an insurer, if you're looking at your book of business and then you're trying to work out where your liabilities are, if you can then apply that limitation period to your data, you may see that there may be some risks which haven't yet developed into litigation. And claimants have missed the window for bringing claims that might give you some security. Under the Consumer Protection Act, there's another limitation period. It's called the 10-year long stop. That means that if a manufacturer puts something on the market, puts it into circulation, 10 years go by, it's safe from being sued under the Consumer Protection Act. That can help you work out your figures and your exposure as well. Co-defendants, I think, will be a big feature here. So whether you're an insurer or manufacturer or distributor, you should be looking to other parties who may have to share some of the liability. An obvious one for manufacturers to do is to look to clinicians, hospitals, doctors, because if they were being warned of the risks and should have used their own professional judgment as a learned intermediary and failed to do so, then you could argue they should share some of the liability risk too. And finally, just a word on claims and contracts. Under case law, NHS patients don't have a contractual relationship with manufacturers, so they won't be able to bring a claiming contract. You might see a few claims if you're insuring private institutions who do have a contractual relationship with patients, but I think claimants will find that difficult because they'll have to demonstrate there was an implied term that they would be supplied with products which met a particular standard, and trying to prove that opioids fail to meet that standard I think could be quite tough. If there's going to be litigation, I think claimants and defendants will immediately go to a judgment from last year as providing a bit of a route map to try and work out what will happen next. Bit of background about this case. This is metal litigation, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. We at RPC acted for one of the 2 manufacturers who were chosen to go forward to the trial that happened last year. As that happens, our aspect of the trial was vacated, but DePuy went ahead to the trial, and the good news is, you've probably heard about it already, but the good news is for manufacturers, insurers, defendants, is that DePuy won. So this is now the leading product liability case, particularly one concerning medicinal products, medical products, and I think will be the key reference point for litigation concerning opioids if it happens here. Now, the judgment is about 160, 170 pages long, but we have distilled it to one word cloud for you, so everything you say is on this screen. Just to pick out a few key points in this judgment to explain why it's so important and why it does provide that route map to litigation here. It concerns claims based on data. So the claimants brought litigation over metal-metal hip implants based on data which will be published in public registries and scientific papers. So they said this data showed that this class of product was performing less well than other types of similar products, and on that basis, the metal-metal hips failed to meet the level expected under the Consumer Protection Act. So they went to war on data, and the judgment that was handed down effectively said the data was not good enough. There were flaws in it, it was incomplete, it just didn't really stand up to robust analysis. However, a careful reading of the judgment shows that I think you can take this case as saying if the data is good enough, if the data had been good enough in this case, the claimants would have got home with one. So I think if litigation happens over opioids, claimants will look at data coming out of public registries, public bodies, and they'll argue that it shows that there is an opioid crisis and the manufacturer should have done something about it sooner than they did. And they'll probably learn the lessons from this litigation to make sure that next time the data they rely upon is better, backed up by better evidence, supported by more experts. And if they can do that, learn the lessons from this, then I think they might win next time. There's this funny aspect of the judgment here called the nocebo effect, which is the opposite of the placebo effect. This is the first time this effect has been recognised in law. Essentially what it means is that you have people who have been treated with, say, an implant or a drug, and there's nothing wrong with them, they're fine. But they start to read about problems experienced by the people who had a similar product. They read about it in the media, perhaps they're contacted by claimant law firms, and then they develop real symptoms of pain. And you can understand this when you think that pain itself is difficult to measure, very subjective, everybody experiences it in a different way. Just bear in mind, because you might think that any kind of class of litigation concerning medical products is under control, but as soon as it gets into the media, claimant law firms pick up on it, people start reading about it, you may see a huge surge in claimant numbers, and some of them, because of the nocebo effect, may have real symptoms. Regulation. This is, it's the leading product liability case, but crucially it's a case for the regulated era. This case, and one 2 years ago, which it refers to, essentially said that where you've got a highly regulated product, like opioid products are, then that would be a very good argument for defendants to make, because they can say, look, the point of the regulations is to protect the public, and if you're compliant with regulations, then you have a safe product which has met some of the most stringent standards in the world, and that is recognised as being a very strong defence. So, depending on whether or not the regulators change their position, this could be a very crucial argument for manufacturers and their insurers. And then finally, one I wanted to mention is this issue of innovation, because this judgment on reading of it, I think is supportive of the argument that there has to be a degree of innovation allowed in the medical sector for the benefit of the public. So in the case of opioids, if you wind back to, say, early 90s, 80s, the medical sector really was crying out for and demanded some sort of solution for certain types of pain experienced by patients. And opioid prescriptions for the right kind of patient provide that solution. And the court recognises in this judgment that if you do anything to the human body, put in an implant or alter its chemical composition with drugs, there will be side effects of some sort. But the court stated that you have to weigh up the risks and the benefits of any kind of product you're putting into the body, and in this case, metal hits, the court determined the benefits outweigh the risks. So I think defendant manufacturers will make the argument about opioids that there was a need, or is a need for opioid drugs. You weigh up the risks and the benefits, it's prescribed properly, then it shouldn't be an effective product.
I suppose the problem with this is they knowingly knew it was addictive and didn't tell anyone, so that'll be the way around it.
Yeah, so that goes into the sort of the marketing side of things and use of statistics.
But it's a non-disclosure thing. From an insurance standpoint, you'd say, well, you know, it's not an occurrence because you intentionally did it. You know it's addictive and you didn't disclose it.
Yeah, we've got a bullet point coming up about that. That'll good one if you're not insuring something under the Insurance Act, because underwriters maybe should know better as well.
But I'm thinking the US actually is more particular.
Very right.
Okay. So Pete talked about claims against the manufacturer, but what about claims against an individual practitioner? I've put up on the slide a case study for us to think about. So it's about Mrs. A, who's a 39-year-old woman with a history of chronic lower back pain. She sees her GP, who prescribes her with a prescription-only opioid painkiller, which I'm sorry, I very unimaginatively called X. Mrs. A returns to her GP 3 months later and reports her pain has partially subsided. So the GP decides to increase the dosage of X and provide Mrs. A with a further 2 months supply. She then goes on to develop an addiction and overdoses, leaving her with significant and long-term health issues. So what kind of claims could come up? Well, as we saw in Gosport, GP could be referred to the General Medical Council and face disciplinary proceedings there. But in terms of claims, they're likely to be based in negligence and could relate to any number of the things that I've put up on the slide. So the assessment and appropriateness of the prescription or dosage. So was this appropriate to prescribe Mrs. A with the painkiller initially? And when she returned and the pain had only partially subsided, was it then appropriate to increase the dose? Or did the fact that it only partially subsided indicate that it in fact wasn't effective in Mrs. A? In terms of other bases, there could be consent issues, failure to warn about the risks of the medication, including the potential risk of addiction. So looking at what was Mrs. A told about painkiller X, and what should she have been told. And then looking at the follow-up, so was the follow-up adequate? Should she have been seen before 3 months? So she was given 3 months supply initially. Should she have been checked up before then? And should she then have been allowed to have a further 2 months supply of an increased dosage? So all of those kinds of questions could be included by claiming it into a potential claim. But what can you do to defend that kind of claim? Well, sorry to use a stock lawyer phrase, but it will turn on the facts of each case. But in terms of the ones that I've put up there, in terms of appropriateness of prescription, if the practitioner can show that they acted in accordance with guidance appropriate at the time, so for example, guidance by NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, then that would go some way towards defending claims based around appropriateness of prescription and dosage. In terms of failure to warn and consenting, if practitioners can show that before prescribing the painkiller or before increasing the dosage, they discuss the risks and benefits, they discuss realistic goals of treatment, and they've warned about the potential for addiction, then that will go some way to defending that kind of claim. There'll also be patient factors that a practitioner might be able to use in defending this kind of claim. So if Mrs. A had failed to disclose some previous condition which would have made prescription of the painkiller inappropriate, so for example if she had a previous addiction or mental health issues such as depression, then that can be used in defending a claim. Or in terms of follow-up, if there had been follow-up scheduled but Mrs. A failed to attend, that could also be incorporated into a defence. I've also put on the slide that there's potential for claims involving pharmacists, and that would usually be in relation to dispensing the drug. But because a pharmacist usually relies on a GP prescription rather than having a consultation with the patient themselves, a claim in negligence might be quite difficult. So a claimant might try to launch a contractual claim, but as Pete mentioned earlier, that might also be difficult because a claim and contract would only be possible in relation to medication supplied privately or over the counter. Another issue in terms of claims involving opioids is the use of online pharmacies. Now, regulation of online pharmacies is a talk in itself, so I'm not going to go into very much detail, but at a very high level I thought I'd draw out a couple of interesting points that have come up in the news recently. So a Guardian investigation at the end of last month found that online pharmacies had been accused of failing to carry out proper checks on proper identity checks and using aggressive marketing to sell strong and addictive opioid medications. There's also been guidance recently on this issue from the General Pharmaceutical Council, and in fact last month as well, the General Pharmaceutical Council announced new safeguards to regulate access to addictive medicines online, including requiring online pharmacies not to allow patients to select prescription-only medications before an appropriate consultation had taken place. And in relation to certain medications, so including medications liable to misuse or abuse, making sure that the prescriber proactively shares information with the patient's GP, of course having got the patient's consent first.
Okay, so I just want to put this slide up. If anyone is still thinking of insuring anybody in the future who produces pharmaceutical products, here's some things to think about. I think you need to be really asking your manufacturing insurers whether they're making full use of providing proper information to users about the risks associated with the product, because in law that can make all the difference to whether one product is defective. You could have a drug which chemically is the same, produced by two different manufacturers. One goes out to the world with deficient warnings and it's found in law to be defective. One goes out to the world with proper warnings, up-to-date information, and in law that won't be defective. So that can make all the difference. Just so educating doctors constantly about the risks associated with the product, what it should be used for, the risk and benefit, and so on. Now, marketing departments can be a problem. We've seen it with some cases we've had at RPC. This is where a product is put through clinical trials, does very well, goes into the market, it's used for a number of years, no problems whatsoever. Then the marketing department of a manufacturer company gets hold of it, and they start pushing for more market share. They're trying to get the patient population expanded. They might be dispensing it via more and more clinicians who perhaps don't have the proper training or as much knowledge as the first batch of hospitals or doctors. And before you know it, what had been product doing quite well, ticking along, suddenly becomes a liability risk because its use has massively expanded in an uncontrolled way. So I'd be asking questions about how much control the marketing department has got over the product. Equally, constantly keep under review what's going out with the product. So in the opioid crisis, good example, more and more information coming out all the time. Make sure manufacturers are acting on it and informing their customers. And as Flo talked about, the regulatory system is tightening up. Regulators are reporting all over the world. Make sure that your manufacturer remains compliant with that too.
So in terms of individual practitioners, as I mentioned in the example, really important to comply and show compliance with all regulatory guidance. That feeds into what Pete was just saying. Also really important to carefully and accurately document decision-making processes, especially around those consent and warning issues, and to ensure that proper processes and checks are in place when prescribing opioid-based medications. So looking ahead, what happens next? Well, we'll hopefully see this year the results of the Public Health England and MHRA reviews into the use of opioid-based medications, so we can better understand where we are and what the scale of the problem is. Given the US position and the media coverage in the UK, it seems to us there's going to be increased scrutiny on prescribing practices in relation to opioid medications. And following on from the new safeguards announced by the General Pharmaceutical Council in relation to online pharmacies and the requirement for opioid medications to carry prominent addiction warnings, we think it's likely there'll be further and more stringent regulatory guidance, particularly following that MHRA consultation. The OECD that I mentioned earlier, they think that doctors should be better at prescribing with new clinical guidelines and better training. So it's likely that that kind of thing will come in. And as I mentioned, for individual practitioners, it's going to be really important that they stay on top of all of that guidance coming out and show that they're complying. As for claims, we think it's very likely that the number of UK claims will increase. Whether or not the claims focus on addiction or warnings or inappropriate prescribing is yet to be seen. We think that claimant firms will have been monitoring very closely what's been going on in the US and all of the different arguments that have been made on both sides before they invest into the UK litigation. From our experience of industry-wide litigation, as Pete mentioned, the metal-on-metal hips litigation, what we found happen is that claimants will use advertisements to draw out potential claimants for a group action. And in terms of opioids, as we've discussed this morning, those actions are going to be complex and involve a whole host of defendants.
So just look at coverage. There's your bullet point. Claims coming in, you have to take a very close look at them and work out how policy responds. I think a big problem, difficulty, could be about injury and how that's been defined in the policy. So bodily injury will normally be the trigger for product liability coverage, but trying to categorise, work out what the injury has been when it comes to opioid forms could be quite difficult. Injuries, potential injuries range from addiction, but that's classified as a brain disease, through to mental health problems, which could come with, say, implications over people being unable to work, which could be expensive, through to breathing difficulties, through to opioids being a gateway for online drugs that are illegal, or even addiction to heroin. So any kind of case on the facts will have to have a careful look at it, because your definition of injury may or may not always trigger coverage. Broadly speaking, from a coverage point of view, don't relax if you're not a manufacturer. You could be a distributor, you could be a clinician, you could be a pharmacist. Anybody could be brought into this. Your point here about addiction being understood or expected as a risk. Wouldn't put this in writing, but what if there was some sort of murky intention? What if something came to light showing manufacturers were marketing on the basis that this stuff was addictive and therefore good for sales? Can you imagine the insurance fallout from that one? Smoking gun. Aggregation will be interesting. I suppose from an insurance point of view, you want to show one originating cause, but as we've discussed today, there are multiple causes of this crisis. It's not just the marketing, it's possible lack of regulatory intervention, it's possible rogue scientific papers, lack of research by the manufacturers. Trying to work out what the cause is and whether that aggregation will apply could be a tough one. Obviously look at your exclusions, jurisdiction, particularly through the States or elsewhere. And then some policies may respond more than others. So don't just think about liability litigation, but you may have regulatory investigations. There may be deaths caused by opioid addiction, which could lead to inquests, which could demand coverage as well. If after all that, anyone in this room still wants to insure pharmaceutical products, here are some ideas about what we can learn from the opioid crisis. Look very carefully at where you are in the supply chain. Probably banged on about this a bit too much, but think very carefully about that spider diagram of different parties. Risk may be anywhere in the system. You may, after thinking about the opioid crisis, choose to exclude particular types of products, perhaps products which are sold widely in the States, perhaps products which could have an addictive quality, maybe products which came to the market in less regulated times. Anything like that that concerns you about the opioid crisis could lead to a think about your exclusion wording. Again, definition of injury. As we understand more and more about problems associated with the opioids, you may want to narrowly define injury to say breathing problems or to say death, and to rule out things like addiction to heroin or pure addiction, which can be difficult to quantify, along with psychiatric damage. Make the most of what you have under the Insurance Act to ask questions about the product, how it's been developed, what's backing it up, what sort of data you've got, how it's been sold, but also we mentioned on the Insurance Act, we're now deemed as underwriters to have that knowledge. That knowledge needs to be applied to any future placements. And a final word to wrap up on, the litigation we discussed, the back catalogue of litigation over the last couple of decades, it's all been product liability litigation, largely speaking because regulations weren't as tight as they are now. We've had a client on some product liability litigation to do with a medical product brought in the 90s who said, frankly, and I'm quoting him, It was a bit like the Wild West back in those days. You could kind of knock out a product. In the 60s, they were being knocked out in garages, and then put onto the market. And in response to the litigation we've referred to, the back catalogue, the EU has now regulated further, so the products are deemed now safer. New regulations coming online to make everything safer for the public. Good news for the public, good news for insurers. What it probably will mean, though, is that the burden on manufacturers will switch from liability more to regulatory compliance, vigilance, and then recall if there's a problem out there. So I think there may be an increased demand in this area for more product recall, even if the liability risk may go away. But that's what we've covered today. Happy to take any questions.
The other issue is the trigger and allocation.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So if you've got a whole big program, where's the fitting program?
Yeah.
Isn't it?
So with the addictive, and when does the addictive list start? Does it start when you first start taking the drug, or is it
Right.
over time?
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got multiple claimants, you might have people coming on different years.
Yeah.
And every time, well, certainly in our system, every time a product's brought to the market, it can be the same product, but you have to look at the state of it when it's put into
Is
circulation.
there a batch control? Is there a batch clause as well?
Yeah,
Back to
so,
batches?
yeah, and you can have one batch that went out with particular warnings that another batch didn't have, and you might find that needs solicitation the other doesn't. So, interesting.
Have there been any suggestion that these drugs have been used off-label in the US?
Yeah, I think part of the argument is that they have been prescribed more treatments than they should be. So I think when they were brought in, it was supposed to be a short-term treatment for, say, chronic pain after, say, a car crash leading to some sort of orthopedic surgery, for example. But then they've been used just on an ongoing basis, which is why.
Years, probably.
Yeah, so the new regulatory guidance in the States that Flo mentioned about limited time frame for the prescription. If they've been used off-label, then I think that then turns a spotlight on the clinician who's been prescribing it, as it has been in this country as well.
And you often see off-label exclusions in liability policies as well. So.
You should do. And on top of that as well, you'd hope that even if you are covering it, the manufacturer's got clear guidance in its own terms about off-label use, and hopefully hasn't implicitly allowed any off-label use for its other correspondence with doctors and stuff.
Obviously focused on the US quite a lot because that's obviously where it's all coming from, and then all comparing this to the UK. Have you heard anything from any other countries? Maybe not something there for research.
No, not really. But if you're interested in claims in the EU, then broadly speaking, what we said about the Consumer Protection Act and how that works is probably more or less the same as we see in the EU as a whole, because the litigation there will be under the Product Liability Directive, which applies the same principles. And there was some guidance out yesterday, the BBC published, showing that in a number of European countries, the problem is beginning to look more and more like the States, although the UK is apparently doing particularly badly.
Can you help us understand what the policy trigger points are in terms of, is it the point at which the drug was first produced, or is it when an individual starts taking it, or when they first become addicted? Or
yeah. Well, I suppose if it's a straightforward product liability point, then you'll be looking at your wording, which will be to do with the injury. And when the injury occurs in, say, an implant, that's quite clear because you'll have date of surgery when the event happens. In a liability claim like this, where you've got a whole time frame to look at, you've got the point of prescription. I think the next point you'd be looking at is the point where they should have stopped taking it.
Yeah.
And then you've got probably further intervention points down the line. So I think it will tell the facts. And if you've got a case or a number of cases where there was failures over warnings, failures over prescribing protocols, well, I think arguably that's the moment. But if you've got an individual case where, say, they were properly prescribed it, and then there was a failure to follow up and a failure to give them a different medication, then I think that could be a trigger point as well.
In the US, it'll probably be date of ingestion through to diagnosis of addiction or the date of filing the lawsuit, and they'll probably go with all sums.
Drag it all in, yeah.
What role have regulators been playing in this? So whilst all this has been unfolding, have there been scenarios where regulators are imposing fines? Like, are they uncovering any fault?
Flo, you get one of them?
Not that I've picked up. I think they're, well, in the UK anyway, at the moment they're kind of reviewing all the evidence before they make any particular recommendations. So that's why I think the MHRA review will be particularly illuminating to see what they've picked up from all of the data that they've looked at. And that'll be where they might decide to, I mean, they've introduced the warning that should be on opioids to say that they're addictive, but whether or not they'll do anything else around, you know, picking up and kind of adding more guidance or more stringent regulation, then I think that's where it'll come from.
There have been a few examples of where a particular manufacturer, say Purdue Pharma, a few years ago was mentioned fined for misleading advertising. So there have been some regulatory interventions there. And the powers of the MHRA in this country are to investigate, and they can criticise, they can ask for recourse in the market, they can impose civil fines or even criminal sentences. The powers are there, but so far not used.
But we don't have the same discovery rules here as we have in the US that see what hidden documents are made.
Well, a manufacturer will have an obligation to comply with a regulatory investigation, and it's got a statutory duty to do so. But
if it's overseas, it's
well, yeah, it's going to be probably very unless it's litigation before, and then you can look at this and disclosure of what comes out of that. And what we tend to have seen, I think this is probably no different, is the regulators are quite slow to catch up. Yeah. So there have been a number of examples where products have gone to the market, it's approved, but then a failure. It can take a very long time for the regulators to do things like form a committee of learned individuals to work out what's happening, and then they take soundings and then report back. So there's quite a regulatory drag on coming up with a solution that gets through in the end.
Yeah, I'd imagine, I'm absolutely no expert in this area, but if we're sort of saying that in scenarios where the justification is that products are regulated and there's stringent regulation there, if the regulator never actually acts on anything, there's no fines imposed, and the claimants, you know, it comes through claimants taking action that brings it all to light, and sort of questions the effectiveness or the reliance on the product being regulated in the first place.
Very good claimant's argument.
In terms of the US, how far back in time do you think we'll be going with this in terms of what policies could be triggered? Florence mentioned patients were seen as consumers from about 1990. Does that mean we're unlikely to see claims policies triggered prior to that?
So the current crisis stems from Florence and launched in
1990. Well, like mid to late 90s, I think, is when they kind of started coming on. And for Purdue's product, OxyContin, that was in 96.
And then you have to, I mean, the States has got two sides. So you've probably got individual claimants who, frankly, might have died before litigation commences with that data. But then you've got the individual states, and that's worth keeping in mind because they will have to demonstrate the financial fallout that they've incurred because of the crisis. And so, from the court's perspective, they'll have to present evidence showing what they've incurred on an annual basis, going back how far. So I think when that detail emerges, then that might help answer that question.
I'd imagine that the manufacturer will sue every single insurer for coverage from the first time they actually ever manufactured that product, because they want to widen the recovery they can get.
Yeah, so see where it might trigger. So the market committee is moving forward.
Similar to the NHL.
Okay, should we draw to a close and say thank you to Peter and Florence for an excellent presentation?